The smell hit me before anything else. Lemon dish soap and that particular brand of dryer sheets my father had bought every single week for 30 years. I was standing at the end of my brother's driveway in Oakville, holding a bottle of red wine, and for a moment I genuinely considered getting back in my car and driving the 2 hours home to Toronto. I didn't, though. I'd promised my brother I would come, and whatever else had happened between me and the rest of them, I had never once broken a promise to him. His name was on the mailbox next to his wife's. That small ordinary thing, 2 names, 1 mailbox, made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. He'd grown up. We both had. Just in very different directions. I rang the doorbell. My father answered. Of course he did. He looked older. The hair at his temples had gone fully white, and there were lines around his eyes I didn't remember. He was still wearing the same kind of flannel shirt he'd worn my entire childhood. Blue plaid, like he'd ordered 100 of them in 1987 and never needed to shop again. He looked at me for exactly 2 seconds before his eyes moved past my shoulder. "Your mother's inside," he said, and walked away. That was it. No hello. No, you look well. Just a 2-second assessment and a pivot. I stepped inside. Let me back up, because the story doesn't start in that doorway. It starts 7 years earlier, in the kitchen of the house I grew up in Hamilton. I was 24. I had just been accepted to the University of Toronto Faculty of Law on a partial scholarship, and I had driven home on a Thursday evening specifically to tell my parents in person. I brought a bottle of sparkling cider. I planned what I was going to say. My father was at the kitchen table with his reading glasses on, going through some papers. My mother was at the counter. I sat down across from him and told him. He took off his glasses. He set them on the table very deliberately. "Law school," he said. "Yes. Off tea. I start in September." He looked at my mother. She looked at her hands. "You're going to spend 3 years and $150,000, he said slowly, "to become something we already have in this family." My uncle on his side was a lawyer. Had been for decades. Corporate law, mostly wills and estates, very comfortable practice in Burlington. This was apparently the problem. Not that I wanted to be a lawyer, that I wanted to be a lawyer without his blessing, without routing it through the family infrastructure, without becoming a junior associate at my uncle's firm. "I got in on merit," I said. "Partial scholarship. I've already looked at financing." "You've already looked?" He repeated it like I'd said something obscene, "without talking to us." "I'm 24. You're living under this roof." I wasn't actually. I'd had my own apartment in Toronto for 2 years. But I didn't say that. I'd learned early that correcting him on facts only extended the conversation in directions that got worse. What followed was 45 minutes that I have mostly chosen not to replay in detail. The short version, my father believed I was doing this to embarrass the family by implying my uncle's firm wasn't good enough. He believed I was making a naive financial decision. He believed law school would change me, that Toronto would change me, that I was chasing something he called a version of yourself that doesn't exist. He said the word ambitious the way some people say reckless. My mother said very little. She refilled his coffee once. "At some point," he said, "if you do this, don't expect us to be waiting when it doesn't work out." I drove back to Toronto that night. I tried somewhere on the QEW, then stopped because I needed to see the road. I enrolled in September. The first year of law school is designed to make you feel like you've made a terrible mistake. The reading volume is inhuman. The Socratic method feels like being cross-examined in public every single morning. I was surviving on student loans, a part-time job at a coffee shop on Bloor Street, and a particular brand of frozen pasta that I still can't look at without feeling tired. My father and I spoke exactly 3 times that year. Short calls. Factual. "How are you?" "Fine. How's the weather there?" "Cold." Okay. My mother called more often, but always in the afternoon, always when he was out. We talked about my brother, about the weather, about a TV show she was watching. We never talked about me being there, doing the thing I was doing in the city I'd chosen. It was like we'd both agreed to only discuss the parts of my life that didn't require her to pick a side. I understood even then. She had her own calculations to make. My brother was the one who actually showed up. He drove up from Hamilton twice in first year, once in January when I was genuinely struggling, and once in March just because he felt like seeing me. He slept on my couch and we ordered pizza, and he asked real questions about what I was learning. He told me our father had said I'd come crawling back by Christmas. He said it without cruelty, just as information the way he'd always relayed things. Matter of factly, like a translator working between two languages. He's wrong, my brother said. I know, I said. I know you know, he said. I just wanted to say it out loud. Second year was harder in different ways, but I was harder too. I'd found my footing. I made law review. I started a clinic placement helping low-income tenants with housing disputes. And something clicked there. The specific intersection of knowing the law and sitting across from someone who needed it desperately and had no map. I was good at it, not in a theoretical way. In the room, actually good. Third year, I was offered an articling position at a mid-sized firm in downtown Toronto. Litigation. The kind of work I'd always wanted. The salary was enough to actually start paying down debt. I called my mother to tell her. That's wonderful, she said. And then, after a pause, you should call your father. I didn't. The articling year was brutal and extraordinary. I was working under a senior partner named, well, she was a kind of person who wore the same expression whether she was praising you or dismantling you, which was somehow more instructive than most feedback I'd ever received. She pushed me hard. I pushed back, appropriately, and she seemed to respect that. At 28, I was called to the bar. On a Tuesday morning in October, in a building on University Avenue with high ceilings and the particular hush of institutional gravity. My brother came. He sat in the third row and grinned at me the entire time, which should have been embarrassing and was actually the only reason I didn't cry. My parents did not come. I had not invited them. I want to be honest about that. I hadn't invited them because I'd known, with the cold clarity of someone who has stopped hoping for a particular outcome, that if they came it would be because my mother had pressured my father. And if my mother had pressured my father, he would have been present in body and entirely elsewhere in spirit, and I would have spent my morning watching his face for something he wasn't going to give me. It was better this way. The room was mine. Afterward, my brother took me to dinner at a restaurant in Kensington Market and we split a bottle of wine and he said, Dad asked me where you were doing your bar ceremony. I looked at him. I told him I didn't know, he said. He refilled my glass. You're welcome. The years after that had their own shape. I built a practice in tenant rights, then expanded into human rights law. I took cases that didn't always pay well but mattered in ways I could trace directly. A woman in Scarborough who kept her housing. A man in Brampton whose wrongful dismissal actually went somewhere. A family in Etobicoke fighting a landlord who had let their unit go toxic with mold. I took the losses hard and the wins harder. I moved from a small apartment to a slightly less small apartment to eventually an actual home. A semi-detached in the East End with a yard that I mostly ignored and a mortgage that I did not. My father and I existed in a state I can only describe as parallel. We were both in the world. We did not intersect. At Christmas, I went to my aunt's in Guelph on my mother's side, which was a long-established alternate universe where no one asked uncomfortable questions. My brother managed the logistics of both families with a patience I found both admirable and faintly heartbreaking. My father had told people, relatives, his friends, people at his golf club, that I was doing something in Toronto. Not a lawyer, not a human rights lawyer. Something. I know this because my cousin mentioned it once gently, watching my face. Something, I repeated. I think he just... She started. It's fine, I said, and mostly it was. You can only be hurt by an absence for so long before it calcifies into something quieter. Which brings me back to the driveway in Oakville. My brother had made partner at his engineering firm. He was 31, which was genuinely impressive, and he had done it the way he did everything, steadily, without drama, building towards something real. His wife had planned a dinner party at their house to celebrate. Immediate family only, she'd said, plus a few of his colleagues. I had spent 20 minutes in a parking lot near the 400 tree deciding whether to go. I went. The house was warm and full of the smell of roasting garlic and whatever candle his wife favored that fall. I said hello to my mother, who held my hands and looked at me with that particular expression she had, relieved and guilty and deeply tired, all at once. I handed over the wine. I helped carry things from the kitchen without being asked, which was how I'd always inserted myself in family situations. True usefulness. My brother found me in the kitchen. You came, he said. I said I would. He hugged me in that brief, solid way that meant something. He knows you're here. I know. He's not going to. I know, I said again. It's your night. Don't worry about it. The dinner was pleasant. My father sat at the opposite end of the table from me, which with 8 people was far enough. We passed dishes. We talked about the drive, about the weather, about my brother's project in Mississauga. One of his colleagues asked what I did, and I said human rights law, and she said, oh, that must be fascinating and difficult in equal measure, and I said, yes, that's exactly what it is. My father looked at his plate. Dessert was my sister-in-law's lemon cake. My brother made a small speech, the kind that was funny and warm without being long. He thanked his wife. He thanked his colleagues. He looked at me across the table and said, and my sister, who taught me that you can want something badly enough to build your whole life around it. And I made myself smile steadily because the alternative was unacceptable. My father set down his fork. Afterward, people moved to the living room. Someone put on music at a low volume. I was refilling my water glass in the kitchen when I heard the front door, and I heard voices, and I heard a name. My brother appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression I didn't immediately understand. There's someone here asking for you, he said. For me. He just nodded, and something in his face made me set down the glass carefully. In the front hallway stood a man in his late 60s, heavy-set, with the kind of posture that doesn't leave you even when everything else does. I recognized him from a photograph I'd seen once, years ago, in a frame on my father's study wall. Back when my father still had a study wall with photographs on it. He'd been my father's commanding officer's adjutant in the Army Reserves decades back, before my father had left the reserves to go into manufacturing. This man had stayed in, had made a career of it. He had driven from Barrie. My brother had quietly, weeks ago, let him know about the party. He hadn't known I'd be there. He saw me. He stopped. His name was Philip. Retired chief warrant officer, I would learn later, though the way he carried himself told you something equivalent before any introduction. He had worked with my father for 4 years in the late 80s. He had followed what I'd been doing, he told me, because his daughter had once been a client of the clinic I'd helped found years ago, and she had told him my name, and he'd put it together gradually. He looked at me the way you look at something you want to confirm as real. Then he said, your work on the Etobicoke case, the Dominguez family, that was you. Yes, I said. That case changed 3 pieces of housing regulation in this province, he said. I followed it closely. I work with a veterans housing advocacy group. Your precedent it's something we cite constantly. I didn't know what to say. I said, I'm glad it's been useful. He shook his head like that wasn't the right word. It wasn't useful. It was a shift. He paused. Then quietly, almost formally, you should be proud of that work. I don't know exactly what order things happened in after that, but at some point I became aware that my father was standing in the hallway. He had come to see who was at the door. He and Philip had not seen each other in perhaps 15 years, and you could see the calculation happening on my father's face. The recognition, then the warmth of it, and then whatever happened to that warmth when he understood the full shape of the moment. Philip turned when he heard my father's voice. They shook hands. There was the brief, gruff reunion of 2 men who had known each other in a particular context and were now older. And then Philip turned back to me, and in front of my father, in front of my brother, in front of his wife and 2 of his colleagues who had drifted into the hallway, he said, your daughter is one of the most consequential human rights lawyers working in Ontario right now. The Dominguez precedent alone. I've used it in 3 separate advocacy cases this year. You must be enormously proud. The hallway was very quiet. My father looked at me. Not past me. Not through me. At me. like he was seeing something he'd misfiled years ago and was only now finding in the right drawer. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The thing I'd spent 7 years building had just spoken for itself in a hallway in Oakville through a man my father had respected for 40 years. My brother's hand found my shoulder briefly. That was enough. Philip stayed for another hour. He and my father talked, the way men of that generation talk, circling things rather than naming them. I spoke with him again near the door when he was leaving, and he gave me his card and said his advocacy group was looking for someone who might occasionally consult on housing cases involving veterans, if I ever had capacity. I said I'd be in touch. My mother hugged me before I left. She held on a moment longer than usual. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. My father was in the living room. I stopped in the doorway. He was sitting with my brother, and my brother was showing him something on his phone, probably photos from the Mississauga project. Normal. Quiet. The way evenings end. He looked up when I appeared. I said, "Good night." He said, "Drive safe." It wasn't much. 7 years of distance and a 2-word send-off. But his voice was different than it had been at the front door 3 hours earlier. Something in it had shifted. I don't know if I can name what it was. Something like acknowledgement. Something like the beginning of a long recalculation. I drove home on the 403 to the QEW to the Gardner, the same route I'd tried on at 24, and the city came up in front of me the way it always did, lit up and indifferent and mine. I didn't cry this time. I turned on the radio and drove. I've thought a lot about that hallway in Oakville, about the specific silence that followed Philip's words. Not an uncomfortable silence, the kind that falls when something true has been said in a room that wasn't ready for it. For a long time, I told myself that moment didn't matter to me, that I'd stopped needing anything from my father years before it happened. And in some ways that was true. I had built a life without his approval as a load-bearing wall, and the structure had held. But I'd be lying if I said I felt nothing when I saw his face change, when I saw him look at me, actually look, for what felt like the first time in 7 years. What I've come to understand is that the holy moment didn't happen because I'd been waiting for it. It happened because I hadn't. The difference matters more than it sounds. When my father told me I was making a mistake, I had 2 choices. I could spend my energy trying to prove him wrong, making every decision with one eye on his reaction, building a career-shaped argument instead of an actual career. Or I could just do the work. Genuinely, seriously, because the work itself was worth doing. I chose the second one, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I think even at 24, I understood that you can't build something real on the foundation of someone else's opinion, not even someone you love, not even someone whose opinion once meant everything. That's the part I want to say clearly because I think it's the part that gets lost in stories like mine. The resolution wasn't the hallway. The resolution was the Dominguez family keeping their home in Etobicoke. It was the president of Philip's advocacy group cited 3 times in a year I knew nothing about. It was every decision I made to take the harder case, ask the harder question, sit across the table from someone who had nothing and figure out how to help them anyway. The hallway was just the moment my father caught up to something that had already happened. Doing right by people, even when it costs you something, even when no one is watching and no one will know, that's not a strategy. It's just what integrity looks like in practice. And I think there's something in how it compounds. Every time you choose it, the next time is slightly less difficult. Not easy, just less of a fight with yourself. The intelligence piece. And I mean this in the plainer sense, not about being clever, but about being curious. About actually learning your craft until you know it well enough to use it for someone else. That part saved me in law school when I was exhausted and eating bad pasta and wondering what I was doing. The work was interesting, genuinely, and that interest kept me at the desk on the nights when nothing else would have. But it was the stubbornness that got me through the years when my father's silence was loudest. The quiet decision, renewed every morning, to keep going anyway. Not out of spite, not to win something, just because the work was mine and I wasn't going to abandon it because someone I loved had decided it wasn't worth doing. My father said good night like a man beginning a long recalculation. I don't know where that recalculation ends. I've stopped needing to know. I drove home on the 403 and the city came up in front of me, zigged and indifferent, and I felt something I can only describe as settled. Not triumphant, just settled. That was enough.